Hi guys, my name's Simon Pavey. I've done Dakar Rally 10 times over the last 15 years. This is my son, Llewelyn Pavey.
Hey, how's it going?
Had the pleasure of going to Dakar together in 2015. We're here at the bike shed in London and we're here to talk about this year's Dakar Rally. For those of you that don't know about Dakar Rally, it's a crazy desert race. It started off in Africa, but the last few years runs in South America, this year in Peru. It's a 10,000 kilometre race, usually over multiple countries, and yeah, it's been going for 30 years. It's the craziest of crazy motorbike races you can do. Plan today is really to show you a little bit around what a Dakar bike is, and then in a couple of hours we're going to talk about this year's race and who's going to win. So this is my Dakar bike from many years ago, 2005 I think. As you can see with the Dakar bike, it's all pretty special. Everything's got to be made bigger. You have to cover a lot of distance, so we have a lot of fuel tanks on the bike. In this era, we had to run for 350 kilometres in the desert, so we needed 51 litres of fuel. This is fuel tank, this is fuel tank, this is fuel tank. I think it's one of the things that's changed dramatically.
Yeah, so in 2011, the rules changed for the name of safety, really. So they reduced the size of the engine capacity and they reduced the required fuel range to make the bikes a bit smaller and, in theory, safer and a bit more accessible. So this one's a 450, and the kind of fuel range you had to make them was only 250 kilometers only. So they managed to take about 20 liters of fuel out of the bikes, which reduced the weight massively. Yeah, so it's kind of a bit more of a custom-built bike as well. It kind of comes out of the factory. The KTM version comes out of the factory ready to go, whereas that bike is a standard street bike turned into a rally bike, basically.
Yeah, I think that's the evolution of the race, really, in many, many ways, and we'll talk about it this evening. But, you know, when I first started doing the race, it was very much sort of get a trail bike or a road bike and put good suspension on it. Basically take what was already a slow bike, make it slower, make it heavier. Whereas these days the race has evolved and it's very much a high-speed race at the front of the field where guys are riding.
Yeah, well, basically since this generation of bike, the whole process of building a rally bike's become much more custom made, really. So from the ground up, this bike is designed just to go fast across the desert. It's a custom built chassis that KTM build for their factory riders, and it's kind of one of the few sports where a normal person can go and buy a race ready bike out of the crate. It's got a trellis chassis, 300mm of suspension, custom made tanks. It's kind of, yeah, 75 horsepower, yeah, a crazy fast bike that doesn't really weigh that much. They're about 175 kilos full of fuel. So yeah, compared to a normal off-road 450, they're really fast, and compared to that, it's incredibly fast.
Yeah.
That was only about 55 horsepower and 230
downhill with the wind behind it.
Yeah, and 230 kilograms of weight with all the fuel on it. So kind of generations have changed a lot.
But I think the last thing to say about Dakar, and the big mystique about it, is that also with that race, not only are you trying to go as fast as you can across the desert, but you have to find your own way. So the real key to success in that event is being able to navigate. And I think, you know, that has changed a little bit, but not much. Basically, the principle's the same. We have this sort of paper notebook. It's good to look at it on the new bike because it's actually got a current road book on it. Yeah, talk us through the navigation, Lel. Tell us how you can find your way.
Well, generally the principle of the navigation is that they give you some really basic instructions. The first one is notes of information based on how far you've traveled. So you start the day at 0 kilometers. We have a trip meter here, which is basically measuring off the front wheel, and it tells you how far you've gone. And then on this paper, when you get to that distance, you then have an instruction on where you're going to go next, with some extra information. Mostly the road books are actually in French, even when they're an English variety, so there's a little bit of French you have to learn. And the principles of it are not that complicated. The kind of other measurement you have is a compass heading that comes up on this extra piece of navigation here, which is generally connected to a GPS. We don't have one because they're given to you by the organizers. Yeah, and that's kind of everything, really. There's no active GPS system. There's no arrow that really tells you where to go. The arrow only works when you get close to a waypoint. So most of the time you're going off just that basic information and trying to find your way across the desert. So just a little bit more on the specifics of what makes especially a KTM rally bike. That's the only kind of pre-built customer bike you can buy. And really KTM kind of build it very specifically for one task. So they start with the engine, and the engine is very loosely based on their Enduro model engine, and then they completely rebuild the internals. And the goal for them is to make as much power as possible and have as much reliability as possible. You can't really change an engine in Dakar. You can't really open one up without time penalties, so you need that engine to last the whole race without breaking down. So they take that engine, they put new internals in it, a stronger gearbox, they give it more oil capacity, you have an oil cooler which you wouldn't have on a normal dirt bike, and then they fit a huge radiator with a really big fan, and they give it a really big air intake. They've got loads of fuel to play with generally as well, so they can do all the things you need to make an engine really fast. And they get those engines from where a stock enduro bike is about 52 horsepower, they're kind of producing around 75 to 80, which takes the top speed of the bike and the general power all the way through to a completely different level. The engines feel incredible compared to a normal dirt bike, even a normal motocross bike. Motocross bikes are generally really fast, and the rally engines feel a whole different league. And then they build a custom chassis around it. Now KTM generally use a trellis chassis, which is kind of similar to what they use on their street bikes. And they use that style of chassis because it's really stable in the desert, and they've generally found it to be much, much better than the kind of typical cradle frame you get on a dirt bike. The next part of a rally bike is the suspension. So generally they have a really long rear shock to deal with the fact that you have a rear fuel tank here. So they make that about 30 mil more travel than you'd get on a normal dirt bike. And the front suspension is generally really high level front suspension that you could find on your motocross bike with standard valving in it, with a standard rally kind of valving in it. Other kind of special parts, especially on this era, this has changed a little bit in the last 5 years, but this era of bike, they built everything really big and really strong. So the swing arm is huge, the wheels are strong, they have a cush drive in the rear wheel. Yeah, generally things are built really big. We've got these custom fuel tanks, which are molded by KTM, specialist mold. So the bike comes looking like this. They have a carbon bash plate. And in the carbon bash plate, you have a 3-liter water tank, which is compulsory in the regulations for safety purposes. So you have to have 3 liters of water for you at all times. And then up here we have the whole navigation area, and you can see it's a pretty complicated mess of wires and bits and bobs. So the navigation towers have changed a little bit in the last few years as well. They used to be metal sheet like this, which was cut and welded and bolted together. And now most of the teams are using some kind of carbon or molded plastic to do the same thing because they're a little bit stronger and lighter. And then you have all the switch gear on the handlebars to control that. We have a steering damper just to prevent deflection at high speed. And that's about it, really. That's what makes up a Dakar rally bike.
So that's it. Look at your dash. Don't look at the terrain. Hold it flat out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Try not to crash.
Try not to crash, yeah.
Come on, you bastard. I can't speak right now. Down's easy. One way or the other, you end up at the bottom.
Hi guys, see, I've done it exactly like you told me not to just then, didn't I? We'll start again.